and take your seats. So before we begin, can you start by introducing yourselves and your teacher, coach, and unit coach?
I'm Wyatt Williams.
I'm Mary Alice Hawes.
I'm Sophia Vallis.
I'm Kayani Vieira, and we are Unit 4. Our unit coach is Mr. Clark, and our school teacher is Mr. Clark.
Great. So the question that we chose for you is question 1. In the Constitution, why are the powers of and limits on Congress addressed first and in greater detail than those of other branches? In addition to the powers granted to Congress in Article 1, what other provisions in the Constitution address legislative powers? Why? How have the enforcement provisions of amendments adopted since the Civil War increased congressional power? Whenever you're ready.
In John Locke's Two Treatises on Government, he stated that the legislative is not only the supreme power, but is sacred and unalterable in hands where the community have placed it. The philosophy of legislative supremacy influenced the framers to establish a strong legislative branch where power is derived from their constituents by reflecting the will of the people through the power of representation.
The framers chose to address the legislative branch first and in greater detail than the other branches because they recognized that a connection between the people and the federal government was essential for withstanding union of states. When the framers convened at the Philadelphia Convention, the first and longest debates to take place were those of representation, spurring from the colonists' experience under the British parliamentary system when they had little opportunity for their voices to be heard. This debate resulted in balancing the interests of the people through the House of Representatives in Article 1, Section 2, and the interests of the states in Section 3.
After experiencing the issues of severely limited Congress under the Articles of Confederation, the framers saw it as a priority to fix the legislative branch and create other branches to check it. They also saw it critical for a withstanding union to have a central government with certain powers over the states, as enumerated in Section 8. The most empowering of which is Clause 18, allowing Congress the subjective power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper.
This power, first backed by the decision in the 1823 case McCulloch v. Maryland, allows Congress to assert influence over states through the elastic clause. Furthermore, the framers recognized that the powers denied to Congress in Section 9 and the powers limiting states in Section 10 affect the whole Union, making them too dangerous to be invested into a single executive.
In addition to the powers granted to Congress in Article 1, Locke's notion of legislative supremacy appears throughout the Constitution. In Article 2, many of the powers granted to the executive, such as the power to make treaties and appointments, are limited by requiring the advice and consent of the Senate. In Article 3, Congress is given significant power over the jurisdiction of the judiciary, such as to allocate the number of justices, to establish lower federal courts, and control appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. The court's ability to review constitutionality of laws came from this provision when the court struck down part of the Judiciary Act of 1789, in the case of Marbury v. Madison, in which Congress added to the court's original jurisdiction without an amendment.
Article 4 allows Congress to establish standards to enforce the full faith and credit clause among the states. However, issues over same-sex marriage has brought up controversy in the 2013 case of Windsor v. U.S. The court ruled that homosexual couples legally married within one state will have their marriage recognized at the federal level, overturning the Defense of Marriage Act and opening the door for the clause to apply to every state. Article 5 allows Congress, without executive approval, to propose amendments with 2/3 consent, while also deciding which method the states will use when ratifying that proposed amendment.
As a result of the Civil War, many of the powers enjoyed by the states, such as the ability to grant citizenship, were shifted to the central government. This shift of power allowed Congress to expand its power in many post-Civil War amendments by reserving its right to enforce the articles by appropriate legislation. This choice of language, along with the elastic clause, has revolutionized Congress to expand its power significantly in order to enact laws in response to state and local actions. Congress is able to use enforcement powers from the 13th Amendment to support civil rights, voting rights, and employment laws throughout the 1960s and 70s.
These enforcement powers were confirmed by the Supreme Court case in decisions like Heart of Atlanta Motel versus the U.S., in which the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title II, supported the court's decision that places of public accommodation had no right to select guests as they saw fit. However, enforcement provisions are not absolute, as shown in the 1997 case of City of Bourne versus Flores, in which the Supreme Court ruled that Congress cannot apply the enforcement provisions of the 14th Amendment to the First Amendment in order to restrict state freedoms. Thank you.
All right. So recently, Israel just dissolved their parliamentary system, or their government. Should the United States have that ability whenever we have lack of faith in our Congress or within our representatives to just reset the button and hold another election?
The ability of the people to decide what is going on within the government is very important, but also within the federal system, the United States was set up in a way that we have checks on each branch to make sure that, for one, there isn't too much power, and also if something isn't going right, there are ways that the people, such as on the state level, all of us could write to our representatives and try to have that affect possibly the federal level through representation.
One of the advantages of having set terms is that sometimes political decisions are not necessarily go along with popular opinion, but they still need to be made. So by having set terms, it allows politicians to make the decisions that need to be made without fear of being voted down.
Okay, Sophia, you mentioned too much power. And in your testimony, you all also mentioned the elastic clause, and you said too dangerous. I'm wondering if you can apply this to the concept of groupthink, which in the communications field relates to a group of people all having the same opinion and keeping each other in line with that opinion. How does, do you need clarification on the question? Okay, so how is groupthink prevented with the systems of government that you're talking about?
One of the original issues that some had with the Constitution, such as Federalist Farmer 10, stated that even if you have a group of people who agree on the same thing, there will still somehow there will be a way that differences are created, and there isn't a way to really keep that solidity within that group. Because of that, I'd say that the only way to make sure that people are trying to stay on the same page is, I mean, there's compromise that can be made which will help with that, but there isn't a way to necessarily check against that.
Excuse me, Mary Alice, did I hear you say something about the 13th Amendment and civil rights enforcement, or did I hear you incorrectly? Did you mention the 13th Amendment?
The 14th and 15th you mentioned?
You mentioned the, okay,
Yes.
I thought I heard the 13th Amendment, I apologize. Regarding the 15th Amendment, are you familiar, anybody on the panel familiar with recent discussions about the Voting Rights Act?
One of the major recent issues are voter ID laws, which require many voters to, or all voters to provide proof of who they are in order to vote. And this can be a disadvantage to people who don't drive or do not necessarily have driver's licenses and can't provide this identification. Mm-hmm. So it conflicts with Voting Rights Act.
And recently, several states challenged the Voting Rights Act. And in 2013, the Supreme Court ruled on that. Are you familiar with that ruling?
No.
Okay. It stood in the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the Voting Rights Act it has outlived its usefulness in some ways, and that many states no longer need to get approval from Congress to make certain voting choices, such as voter ID. And Texas has gone ahead then and implemented voter ID. What do you think about that? Is that do you think that race relations have improved enough so that we no longer need the Voting Rights Act?
One of the main goals of the Voting Rights Act was to limit Jim Crow laws in the South, which were a result of Reconstruction, and the South wanting to put a limit on the ability of African Americans. Because of that, even with voter ID laws, there could be many different kinds of races, many different genders, many maybe ages that could be affected. Because of that, it's definitely needed for the federal government to step in and say, no, you have to make sure that there are no restrictions placed because everyone has the right to vote.
The state's place on this matter is that they have control over the times, places, and manners of elections. However, as seen through things like the Jim Crow laws, I still think, the Voter Rights Act is still necessary because these sort of voter ID laws still do target certain races or socioeconomic backgrounds.
Thank you.
Sophia talked a little bit about some provisions that they might have. I was just going to offer something that I think is a good idea to kind of reach out to those maybe who can't drive or the elderly. Maybe giving a way to mail in ballots or to reach out to the elderly in homes and other ways to make sure they're voting. That would be definitely another very effective way.
The state of Nebraska, within their state legislature, they have a unicameral legislature, so they only have one branch in the legislative branch. Should the United States federal government get rid of one branch and move to a unicameral system?
I think it's extremely important that the legislative branch has two branches, mostly for the fact that the House of Representatives is very closely linked to the people, and that is the main point. It shows a bit more diversity, perhaps, than the Senate might. So I think it's very important that there are two branches within the legislature.
President Ronald Reagan once stated that it's important to remember that the federal government didn't create itself; the states created the federal government. So I believe the Senate's still necessary in our federal system because it represents the states and their interests.
Also, under the parliamentary system that the United States experienced under colonies, there was little representation for the colonies. In addition, even in Great Britain, their parliamentary system works in a way that the people aren't directly represented. There's more of a universal representation. So one person will get assigned to a district, but they may not know anything about that district. Because of that, I think that it can be very dangerous to simply have one legislature that may not be as connected to the people.
Your question says, and it's absolutely correct, that after the Civil War, several of the amendments and other factors led to an expansion of the power of Congress and the federal government as a whole vis-a-vis the states. Do you think, and that is a very controversial issue across the nation and in Nevada today, do you think congressional power and federal power has increased too much, or is the balance is just about right?
There are definitely certain powers that the federal government has the states do not have, and within that there are definitely some that cross over. Because of that, the national government has to make sure that they're checking the states so that states aren't getting too out of hand and making laws that are too controversial. But the states are also very regional, and each state has different implications, different people within that state. So the laws that they make are very regional, and they need to apply simply to that state. So because of that, I think it's important that the federal government has like an umbrella of power, as long as the states have the power to regionally, within their state, control any laws there.
Like you said, it's a very controversial issue, and I think where the power should lie really depends on the specific issue at hand. For example, if it's national security, clearly the federal government would be more effective. If it's more local matters, state should be more effective. And there's this notion of double security where each government sort of clashes with each other over these issues.
I would agree with my colleague Wyatt. I think the beauty of federalism is that it is, in a way, a balancing act, and it's very important for the government to implement their ability to check each other.
I like to see federalism as a player-referee standpoint. Personally, I play the sport of soccer, and we have 3 referees, a center, and 2 outsides. Without the referees in the game, the players really have no place, and without the players, the referees have no place. The referees also have more jurisdiction over the players in a way because they're enforcing and they're making sure they're following all the rules. So in that sense, I definitely believe the federal government should have more power to check and protect. But without the states and without the people, the federal government really has no power.
I wanted to go back to the idea of representation. So with the demographics that in our country today, do you feel like that United States...
We won't know. We'll stop there. Don't go anywhere. Right. Go ahead, feedback.
Whew, okay, I'll start. So I got my speech teacher hat on.